It began with fire, not with battle cries, not with parades of victory, but with an eerie silence pierced by the distant clatter of burning timber and the low hiss of railroad steel melting in the night. It was November of 1864. General William Tecumseh Sherman, lean, pale-eyed, and eternally restless, stood in the shadows of a broken Atlanta, a city he had just conquered and now ordered to be emptied and undone. Where once trains carried commerce and people, now only twisted wreckage, and the glow of controlled destruction remained. And yet, this was not the end. It was only a beginning. For Sherman had a new vision: to march across Georgia, from Atlanta to the sea, cutting the Confederacy in half, not with cannons alone, but with psychological devastation. He would not just defeat the South militarily, he would make Georgia howl. But the question remains even today: was Sherman a liberator or a destroyer? Did his march to the sea signal the final push toward justice and unity in a broken nation? Or did it set the stage for a century of bitterness, division, and unresolved wounds? This is the story of that march. A campaign unlike any before or after it. A total war not just of armies, but of will. The build-up, from stalemate to scorched earth. By the autumn of 1864, the American Civil War had entered its fourth agonizing year. In the East, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were locked in a bloody stalemate near Richmond and Petersburg, a trench-bound deadlock that chewed through men and morale with no end in sight. In the North, the upcoming presidential election threatened Abraham Lincoln's grip on power. His opponent, George B. McClellan, campaigned on a platform of peace, even if it meant Southern independence. Lincoln needed a battlefield victory, a big one, and that's where Sherman came in. A month earlier, in September, Sherman's troops had finally taken Atlanta after a brutal campaign of maneuvering and sieging. The Confederates, under General John Bell Hood, had been forced to retreat, burning ammunition stockpiles as they fled. For the people of Atlanta, it was a catastrophe. For Lincoln, it was a political miracle. Sherman, now promoted to Major General, established his headquarters in the shattered city. But he had no intention of staying. "I can make the march and make Georgia howl," he wrote to both Lincoln and Grant. His plan: abandon the long supply lines, live off the land, cut a 60-mile wide swath through the South, destroying infrastructure, supplies, and the will to resist. It would be the first modern campaign of psychological warfare. After initial hesitation, Grant approved it. His reply was short and clear: "Go as you propose." On the 11th of November, Union troops began tearing up Atlanta's railways. By the 15th, Sherman's army was on the move. Before leaving, Sherman issued orders: destroy everything that could be of military value. Factories, foundries, railroads, churches, and homes were technically spared. But in the chaos of demolition and fire, entire neighborhoods were consumed. By the time the last soldier marched out, 40% of Atlanta had been reduced to ashes. Sherman divided his forces into two wings. Major General Henry Slocum led the left, marching through Milledgeville. Major General Oliver O. Howard took the right, heading toward Griswoldville and Savannah. In total, Leuchar, 000 infantry, Wu, 12 cavalry, and 2,000 artillerymen began the 225-mile march. They carried no supply train, only what they could find. and what they could destroy: the foragers, bummers, and liberation. Sherman's army would become infamous for its foraging detachments, teams sent ahead of the main force to gather food, supplies, and livestock from the countryside. Official orders were clear: take only from wealthy supporters of the Confederacy, avoid looting homes, avoid unnecessary cruelty. Reality, however, told a different story. Many soldiers saw themselves as instruments of divine justice, and every plantation was fair game. They seized horses, cattle, corn, and bacon, but also jewelry, silverware, fine clothing, and even pianos. Some buried their valuables. Others left them in the hands of enslaved people, hoping Union soldiers would respect them. But the truth was, the line between foraging and looting often blurred and sometimes vanished entirely. Yet in this chaos, there was also liberation. As the columns passed through Georgia's plantations, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children left their bondage and followed the bluecoats. To them, Sherman's army was not destruction, it was deliverance. The number of freed people following the army grew into the thousands, but feeding and sheltering them became a logistical nightmare. Not all officers agreed on what to do. Some welcomed them, others resented them, and one, in particular, would make a decision that haunts the legacy of the march to this day. On the 23rd of November, Slocum's wing reached Milledgeville, the state capital. The Confederate governor and legislature had already fled. Union troops held a mock session of the Georgia legislature in the abandoned Capitol building, voting symbolically to repeal secession.
As the weeks wore on,
it
the
was
landscape
psychological
changed.
warfare.
Sherman's
at its
men
most
were now
theatrical.
entering Georgia's low country.
Sherman's men destroyed
coastal
cotton
plains
gins,
riddled with swamps,
mills,
rivers, and muddy trails.
and rail lines.
The bountiful plantations of
Even the
central
home of
Georgia
Howell
gave way
Cobb,
to marshland,
a
where
former
food was
U.S.
scarce, and resistance became more
Congressman
desperate.
turned Confederate official.
The number of freed slaves
was
trailing the
burned,
columns continued to rise.
except the slave quarters,
Some brought carts and livestock.
which were spared in
Others
symbolic
carried
defiance.
only what they could bear.
Soldiers took pride
Many
in
were
bending and
elderly
twisting rails
or
around
children.
trees into what they
Few
called
had any means
Sherman's
to keep up.
neckties, deliberate symbols
Union
of
soldiers
unrecoverable
watched with
damage.
conflicted hearts.
Everywhere the
To them,
Union Army went,
these people represented
they
the
left
very cause
nothing
they were fighting
behind
for.
that could
And
sustain
yet,
rebellion.
They were also
Yet
another mouth to
Confederate
feed,
opposition was still
another
present,
soul to protect,
if feeble.
another risk to the mission.
General Joseph Wheeler led bands
One
of
officer
Confederate
wrote
cavalry
bitterly,
skirmishing
"They followed us like
ambushing,
shadows, and we could
and
neither turn
harassing
them back
Union
nor carry
foragers."
them forward."
In one
Sherman,
case,
pragmatic and
Union
unromantic,
cavalry under
saw
Howard
these
was
followers
ambushed
as a
and drawn into
humanitarian
Griswoldville,
liability.
where
He
they
knew
clashed
what
with
they
3
fled from.
brigades of
He
Georgia
did not
militia.
know what to do with them.
The battle was
But one
fierce.
of his generals made that
But
choice for
one-sided,
him. On the night of
the
December
militia
8th,
suffered severe
Brigadier General
casualties.
Jefferson C.
Buying
Davis,
only a little
no
time,
relation to the Confederate
Sherman's
president,
army
reached the banks
marched
of
on,
Ebenezer Creek,
but with
roughly
every
20
mile,
miles from Savannah.
the burden of
His
fugitive
engineers
slaves and
constructed a
dwindling
pontoon
food
bridge
grew
to
heavier.
ferry his troops across the
Soon,
dark, icy waters.
that burden would become tragedy.
As Davis's
As the
14,000
weeks
men
wore
crossed,
on,
hundreds of
the
freedmen
landscape
and freedwomen
changed.
waited nearby,
Sherman's
hoping
men
to
were
follow.
now entering Georgia's
They were
low
not
country
part of the
coastal
army.
plains riddled
They
with
had
swamps,
no orders.
rivers,
But they had
and
placed
muddy
their
trails.
trust in blue uniforms.
The bountiful plantations
Then,
of
without
central
warning,
Georgia gave
General
way to
Davis cut the
marshland,
bridge down,
where
pulling
food
it
was
back to the
scarce,
far shore.
and
The crowd
resistance became
panicked.
more desperate.
Some screamed.
The
Some
number
prayed.
of free slaves
Some
trailing
tried
the
to
columns
swim.
continued to rise.
Union soldiers,
Some brought carts and livestock. Others carried
disobeying
only
orders,
what they could bear.
threw logs, ropes,
Many were elderly
anything that could float.
or children.
But many drowned,
Few had any
dragged
means
under
to
by
keep
freezing
up.
currents.
Union soldiers
Others
watched
were
with
captured
conflicted
by
hearts.
Wheeler's Confederate cavalry,
To them,
who arrived soon
these
after.
people represented
It
the very
was,
cause
to
they
many
were
in
fighting
Sherman's
for,
ranks, a betrayal
and
of
yet
everything they believed
they
in.
were also another mouth
Major
to feed,
James Connolly, an
another
officer in
soul to
Davis's
protect,
division, wrote,
another risk to the
"To
mission.
think that 500 or
One
600
officer wrote
women,
bitterly,
children, and old
they
men
followed
were
us like
sent back into
shadows,
slavery by such a
and
man
we
was
could
too
neither
much."
turn them back
I
nor
said
carry
so,
them forward.
and loudly.
Sherman,
Complaints traveled up the chain
pragmatic
of command,
and unromantic,
but Jefferson C. Davis
saw
was
these
never
followers
punished.
as a humanitarian
Sherman,
liability.
lacking
He knew
experienced
what they
field
fled
commanders,
from.
kept him in
He
place.
did not know what to do with
But the
them.
stain of that event
But
could
one of his
not be
generals made
erased,
that choice
and it
for
forced
him.
Sherman to act.
On the night
On
of the
January
8th of
16,
December,
1865,
Brigadier General
weeks after the
Jefferson
march had
C.
ended, Sherman
Davis, no
issued
relation
Special
to the
Field
Confederate
Orders Number
president,
15,
reached the banks of
one of the
Ebenezer
most
Creek,
significant, if temporary,
roughly 20
acts
miles
of
from
post-war
Savannah.
policy in the
His
entire
engineers
war.
constructed a
It
pontoon
granted
bridge to
40
ferry his
acres of
troops
land to
across the
each
dark,
freed black family
icy
along
waters
the southern coast,
as Davis's
including parts
14
of Georgia and South
Seattle
Carolina.
men crossed.
The order was meant as a
Hundreds of
response to
freedmen and
Ebenezer
freedwomen
Creek,
waited
but
nearby,
also as a
hoping
recognition
to
of the
follow.
freedmen's sacrifices
They
and
were not
suffering.
part of the army.
It was a military
They had
order,
no
not
orders,
a law. And after
but they had
Lincoln's
placed their trust
assassination,
in blue
President
uniforms.
Andrew Johnson
Then,
would later revoke it,
without
returning
warning,
the land to former
General Davis
Confederates.
cut the bridge down,
But in the moment, it
pulling it
marked an
back to the far
extraordinary
shore.
shift. The
The
war
crowd
was no
panicked.
longer just about Union.
Some
It was
screamed,
now, in Sherman's
some
own words,
prayed,
about justice.
some tried to swim.
Slavery must be utterly
Union
wiped out,
soldiers
and
disobeying
wherever the
orders
enemy
threw
goes,
logs,
we must make him feel the
ropes,
hard hand of war.
anything
As
that could
Sherman's
float,
columns approached the
but
city of
many
Savannah,
drowned,
the Confederate
dragged under
defenders
by
made
freezing
one last
currents.
desperate move.
Others were
They
captured by
buried
Willard's
mines,
Confederate cavalry,
known then as
who
torpedoes,
arrived
along the
soon
roads and
after.
trails.
It
These
was,
early landmines were
to
crude,
many in
often
Sherman's
made from
ranks,
buried artillery
a
shells with
betrayal
pressure
of
triggers.
everything they believed
But
in.
they were terrifyingly
Major
effective.
James Connolly,
Men were blown
an
apart by
officer
invisible
in Davis's
devices.
division,
Marching columns stopped
wrote,
in their tracks.
to think
Morale
that
plummeted.
500 or
Sherman was
600 women,
enraged. He saw the use of
children,
mines as cowardly
and old men
and a
were
violation of the
sent back into
Gentleman's Code of
slavery by
War.
such a man
And so
was too
he issued
much.
an unforgiving
I said
command.
so,
Confederate
and
prisoners of war
loudly.
would clear the minefields,
Complaints traveled
even when
up
they
the chain
didn't
of
know where the
command, but
mines were
Jefferson
buried.
C.
It
Davis
was
was never
harsh.
punished.
Many saw it as vengeful.
Sherman,
Sherman saw it as
lacking
justice.
experienced field commanders,
They laid them. They may
kept them in
remove
place.
them, he said
But the
coldly.
stain of that
By
event
December
could
10,
not be erased,
Sherman's army had
and
reached
it
the
forced
outskirts of
Sherman to
Savannah.
act.
There,
On the 16th of
entrenched behind
January,
defensive lines,
waited
waited Confederate General William
weeks after the
Hardy
march had ended,
with 10,000 troops.
Sherman issued
Sherman,
special
now
field
hundreds
orders
of miles deep
No.
into enemy territory,
15,
faced a
one of the
choice:
most significant
besiege the city
if
and risk
temporary,
starvation,
acts
or
of
find another
post-war
way
policy
in.
in the entire
He chose
war.
the latter.
It
On December
granted 40
13th,
acres of
Union
land to
troops
each
assaulted
freed
and
black
captured
family
Fort
along the
McAllister,
southern
just
coast,
south of Savannah.
including parts
The
of
victory
Georgia
opened
and
up a
South
supply line
Carolina.
to the sea,
The order
allowing
was
Union
meant
Navy
as a
ships to
response
finally
to
deliver
Ebenezer Creek,
food, ammunition,
but
and
also
letters from
as a
home.
recognition of the
For the
freedmen's
first time in
sacrifices
over
and
a
suffering.
month, Sherman's men were
It was a
connected to the
military
outside
order,
world. Then,
not a
on
law.
December 17th,
And after
Sherman sent
Lincoln's
Hardy a letter.
assassination,
I beg to
President
present
Andrew
you with an
Johnson would later
opportunity to
revoke it,
save the
returning the
city of
land to former
Savannah
Confederates.
from destruction.
But in the
Hardy
moment,
refused,
it
but he
marked
did
an
not stay to
extraordinary
fight.
shift.
On the night of December
war was
20th,
no longer
he
just
quietly
about
evacuated, slipping
It
his
was now,
forces across the Savannah
in
River
Sherman's
into
own
South
words,
Carolina. The
About
next day,
justice.
the mayor of Savannah
Slavery
surrendered the city.
must be
Sherman
utterly
sent a telegram to
wiped out.
President Lincoln,
And
famously
wherever the enemy
declaring,
goes,
I beg to present
we
to
must
you,
make him
as a
feel
Christmas gift,
the hard hand
the
of
city
war.
of Savannah,
The
with
mines of
150
Savannah.
heavy guns and
As
plenty of
Sherman's
ammunition,
columns approached the
and
city
also
of Savannah,
about
the
25,000 bales of
Confederate
cotton.
defenders made
Sherman had
one
done it.
last
He had
desperate
marched
move.
across Georgia,
They buried
unopposed,
mines known then
unsupported,
as
and
torpedoes
unrelenting.
along the roads and
The
trails.
Confederacy was now
These
split
early
in two.
landmines were
The
crude,
myth of Southern
often
invincibility
made
had
from
been
buried
shattered,
artillery shells with
but
pressure
Sherman
triggers,
was just getting
but they were
started.
terrifyingly effective. Men were blown apart by invisible devices. Marching columns stopped in their tracks. Morale plummeted. Sherman was enraged. He saw the use of mines as cowardly and a violation of the Gentleman's Code of War, and so he issued an unforgiving command. Confederate prisoners of war would clear the minefields, even when they didn't know where the mines were buried. It was harsh. Many saw it as vengeful. Sherman saw it as justice. They laid them, they may remove them, he said coldly. By the 10th of December, Sherman's army had reached the outskirts of Savannah. There, entrenched behind defensive lines, waited Confederate General William Hardy with 10,000 troops. Sherman, now hundreds of miles deep into enemy territory, faced a choice: besiege the city and risk starvation, or find another way in. He chose the latter. On the 13th of December, Union troops assaulted and captured Fort McAllister, just south of Savannah. The victory opened up a supply line to the sea allowing Union Navy ships to finally deliver food, ammunition, and letters from home. For the first time in over a month, Sherman's men were connected to the outside world. Then, on the 17th of December, Sherman sent Hardee a letter. I beg to present you with an opportunity to save the city of Savannah from destruction. Hardee refused, but he did not stay to fight. On the night of the 20th of December, he quietly evacuated, slipping his forces across the Savannah River into South Carolina. The next day, the mayor of Savannah surrendered the city. Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln, famously declaring, I beg to present to you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Sherman had done it. He had marched across Georgia, unopposed, unsupported, and unrelenting. The Confederacy was now split in two. The myth of Southern invincibility had been shattered, but Sherman was just getting started. Savannah had fallen without a final battle, but Sherman's gaze was already turning north towards South Carolina, the birthplace of secession. If Georgia had howled, South Carolina, Sherman promised, would scream by January 1865. While Grant pinned down Lee in the trenches of Petersburg, Sherman prepared to unleash his next campaign not just to crush Confederate armies, but to demolish morale, shatter industry, and rip up the roots of rebellion. This was no longer just a march. It had become retribution. Sherman's troops began their march into South Carolina in early February, 1865. Unlike Georgia, South Carolina was not simply a Confederate state. It was the first, the loudest, and in Sherman's eyes, the most guilty. South Carolina was the cause of our woes. He wrote to his wife, and she shall have her share of the punishment. Rainfall was relentless. Roads turned to rivers. Bridges had to be rebuilt almost daily. But the wrath of Sherman's men matched the elements. If Georgia had been scorched, South Carolina would be charred to its soul. Farms were destroyed wholesale. Towns were reduced to ash. Railroads were uprooted and twisted into knots. Union soldiers, many of whom had lost friends or brothers in earlier battles, saw this destruction as justice served hot. Some Confederate prisoners were even made to watch the burning of their homes. Sherman insisted he did not order the burning of Columbia, the state capital, which was reduced to cinders after Union troops entered it in mid-February. But whether accidental or deliberate, the message was clear. No sanctuary remained in the South. By March, the Confederacy was collapsing on all fronts. General Hood had been defeated in Tennessee. Hardee had been forced to abandon both Savannah and Charleston. Lee, still holding Petersburg, was being bled dry, and now Sherman was marching through the Carolinas, aimed directly at Lee's rear. Meanwhile, a desperate attempt by Confederate generals to unite under Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina was being assembled, but it was too late. The South had no industrial base left, no food, no spirit. Sherman's march had done more than destroy cities. It had destroyed hope, but hope had a different name now, and that name was peace. In March 1865, as Sherman's army approached Goldsboro, North Carolina, Johnston made one last stand at the Battle of Bentonville. It was a last gasp, a desperate attempt to bloody Sherman enough to stall the advance. The Confederate forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Sherman's veteran troops, toughened by months of marching and destruction, held firm, and Johnston withdrew. The Confederate line was broken beyond repair. Soon after, Sherman linked up with Union forces coming from the coast. Together, They now formed a pincer, aimed squarely at Lee's army of Northern Virginia. The walls were closing in. Less than a month later, on the 9th of April, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. Sherman would go on to accept Joseph E. Johnston's surrender just weeks later, effectively ending all major hostilities. His march had played a pivotal role in making that possible. By cutting off resources, destroying infrastructure, and demoralizing the Confederate heartland, he had made the war unwinnable for the South. But the question would linger: at what cost? The damage left behind. Sherman's 37-day march across Georgia did an estimated $100 million in damage in 1864 dollars. Adjusted for today, that's over $1 billion. Over 300 miles of railroad were destroyed. Thousands of horses and mules were seized. Millions of pounds of food and supplies were consumed or burned. Entire towns, plantations, and mills were left as smoking ruins. But the psychological impact was greater still. The Confederacy was no longer invincible. Its citizens were no longer untouched. Its morale, the real fuel of war, had been doused in salt and flame, legacy, and controversy. Even today, Sherman's march remains deeply divisive. To some, he is a hero, a military genius who helped end the bloodiest war in American history. To others, he is a villain, a man who punished civilians, destroyed homes, and unleashed total war on an already crumbling enemy. But Sherman himself was never confused about his place in the story. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. He once said, "Those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out." He did not delight in destruction. He simply believed it was necessary, for only by breaking the back of rebellion could the Union be preserved. Only by showing the South what war truly meant could peace ever return. In the years that followed the Civil War, the South entered a period known as Reconstruction, an attempt to rebuild the Union and reshape the South without slavery. But the scars of Sherman's campaign ran deep. Cities had to be rebuilt, crops replanted, lives reimagined. Some Southern families never recovered. They passed down stories of Sherman the Devil, of stolen silver, burned barns, and laughing Union soldiers riding off with prize horses. In this oral tradition, Sherman became not just a man, but a symbol. To many white Southerners, he represented Northern tyranny. To Black Americans, he was remembered as the liberator, the fire that broke their chains. Both views are incomplete, yet both, strangely, are true. Sherman did not march through Georgia simply to win a war. He marched to change the South forever. The man behind the march, William Tecumseh Sherman, would go on to become commanding general of the U.S. Army, second only to President Grant. He refused all calls to run for political office, most famously saying, "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." He saw himself as a soldier, not a politician. But perhaps more than any general of his age, he understood the power of narrative, of what war could do to memory, to nations, to the soul of a people. He was not gentle, but he was honest. When asked whether the war had been worth its cost, he answered plainly, "Since the public mind has settled to the conclusion that the institution of slavery was so interwoven in our system that nothing but the interposition of war could have eradicated it, I believe the war was worth all that it cost in life and treasure. The unfinished business," and yet, even as fires cooled and the ashes blew east into the Atlantic, nothing had been truly resolved. Yes, The Confederacy was gone. Yes, slavery was abolished. But the questions Sherman's march raised still haunt American soil. What does victory look like when it costs your own soul? How do you rebuild a people you had to burn to the ground? Can you destroy a system without creating new bitterness to take its place? Sherman never claimed to have those answers. He only did what he believed had to be done. But he left behind a landscape and a nation forever changed. Somewhere along the old trail from Atlanta to Savannah, perhaps buried beneath the soil or etched in the iron of a twisted rail, is the echo of a larger truth. Empires do not fall in an instant. They unravel by fire, by famine, and finally, by the fading belief in their own cause. And in that unraveling, something new begins. The march to the sea was not the end of the Civil War. It was the beginning of a new American century, one born in fire and still smoldering. Thank you for watching Legacy Files. If you found this documentary compelling, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys into the forgotten, the formative, and the firestorms of history. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant,